first time Amelia Mercer saw the 1898 photograph enlarged on the restoration screen, she thought the museum curator had called her in to admire the family legacy before the gala. Then the image sharpened, and the little boy in the center of the picture was not holding his mother's hand. He was reaching behind the carved velvet chair, gripping the smallest finger of the woman everyone in every archive had labeled as the maid. Amelia leaned closer without realizing she was holding her breath. The room smelled like old paper, dust, and the sharp chemical trace of photographic varnish. On the table beneath the monitor, the original glass plate sat under a soft museum lamp, cracked in one corner, but otherwise almost cruelly intact. Her family had donated it 52 years ago. It had been reproduced in books, framed in boardrooms, printed in brochures, and praised in speeches as the portrait that captured the beginning of Mercer shipping's golden era. Gideon Mercer seated in the middle, his elegant wife, Vivian, beside him in satin and pearls. Their young son, Samuel, posed at their knees in a sailor suit. Standing behind them, half in shadow, a young woman in a dark, high-collared dress with her eyes lowered. For more than a century, the caption beneath that figure had read, "Housemaid, name unknown." But now the resolution was so clear, Amelia could see the pressure in the child's knuckles. He was clutching that woman like he belonged to her. "Children don't usually hold still through a long exposure unless they're anchored," said Nora Bell, the curator, her voice low. "Especially boys his age." Amelia didn't take her eyes off the image. Maybe he was fidgeting. Maybe. Nora clicked one key, and the picture sharpened even more around the hands. Or maybe historians spent 100 years looking at the expensive people in the front and never noticed the truth standing in the back. Amelia felt something cold slide through her chest, because now she could see something else. The boy's body wasn't turned toward Vivian. It leaned backward, toward the woman behind the chair, toward the hand he trusted enough to reach for without looking. If you like stories where the truth stays buried until it tears a family open, stay with me, because this one didn't just expose a forgotten woman. It destroyed a legend. 3 nights later, Mercer House was supposed to host the biggest event in its modern history. The old waterfront mansion had been turned into a museum, and Amelia, 34, neat-spoken, careful, raised to carry herself like the name itself had bones, had spent 11 months preparing the gala. The mayor was coming, local press was coming, 2 state historians were flying in, investors were donating money to expand the Mercer Heritage Foundation. Her father had already rehearsed his speech twice, both times in the same tone he used when talking to waiters and journalists. Pleasant on the surface, threatening underneath. Legacy, Julian Mercer liked to say, is not what happened, it's what survives. At the time, Amelia had thought it was wisdom. Now, it sounded like a warning. She found her father in the library the next morning, standing near the bay window with one hand in his pocket and one on a crystal tumbler he hadn't touched. Julian Mercer was 62, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, handsome in a polished, expensive way that made strangers assume he must be kinder than he was. Behind him hung the famous 1898 portrait in oil reproduction, softened by brushstrokes that blurred the hands. Amelia looked at the painting, then at him. Who was she? He didn't blink. Who? The woman behind the chair. An employee, I assume. You assume? He finally looked at her. Why are we doing this? Because the museum restoration team found something strange in the original. His jaw tightened so slightly someone else might have missed it. Amelia didn't. What kind of strange? The boy in the photograph is holding her hand. That proves nothing. No, Amelia said, not by itself. That was when his face changed. Not much, just enough. Not fear exactly, more like the discomfort of a man who had hoped a locked door would stay locked forever. Julian set down the glass. The gala is in 3 days. I don't want speculative nonsense distracting from the foundation announcement. Speculative nonsense. It was such a controlled phrase, so quick, so prepared. Amelia took a step closer. Did you know her name? No. Did your father? He sighed like she was exhausting him. Amelia, every old family has loose threads. That's why museums exist, to arrange them into something useful. Useful to who? To the living. That should have sounded practical. Instead, it made her stomach turn. By noon, she was in the archives room at Mercer House with Nora and a volunteer named Luis, who smelled faintly of coffee and old cardboard and handled paper like it could cry out if bent the wrong way. They pulled household ledgers, shipping papers, a baptism register copy, society clippings, and one cedar box of uncatalogued items that had sat untouched for years because somebody generations earlier had marked it personal and then never explained what that meant. The first real crack came from a receipt, a dry little thing, browned at the edges, easy to miss. Payment issued to Mrs. Eliza Hart for wet nurse and nursery duties, April 1898. Mrs., not Miss, not staff, not servant girl. Mrs. Nora held the slip between two gloved fingers. That alone doesn't prove relationship. No, Amelia said, already reaching for the next paper. But it proves somebody knew her name. By late afternoon, they had found it again in a pantry inventory, in a medicine purchase ledger, and once in a repair bill for the upstairs nursery fireplace. Instructed by Mrs. Hart to protect the child from drafts. Protect the child, not serve the child. The phrasing sat wrong, intimate, possessive in a way that domestic language usually wasn't. Then Luis opened a narrow ledger wrapped in blue ribbon and quietly said, "I think you need to look at this." Inside was a list of household expenses in Vivian Mercer's own hand. Sharp loops, proud downward strokes, expensive confidence inked across every line. Candles, linen soap, pear-pins, imported tea, physician's fee. And then, without flourish, additional clothing for Samuel after Heartwoman refused cast-offs. Amelia read it twice. Heartwoman. Not nurse, not caretaker. Heartwoman. Like she was a problem to be contained. Like everyone in that house knew exactly who she was and had agreed never to say it plainly. That night, Amelia drove home through a curtain of harbor fog, the kind that made streetlights look bruised around the edges. She should have gone to sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with takeout gone cold beside her and stared at a scanned copy of the photograph on her laptop until nearly 2 in the morning. The more she looked at the picture, the more unbearable it became. Gideon Mercer sat with one hand resting on the chair arm between his wife and child, like a man pleased with what the world believed belonged to him. Vivian's spine was straight as a blade, her chin lifted in that old money way photographs used to capture so well. And Eliza, because the unknown maid had a name now, and Amelia could no longer think of her any other way, stood behind them with her face lowered, but not defeated. That was what unsettled Amelia most. There was pain in the woman's posture, yes, but there was also restraint. The kind it takes not to snatch your child back in front of the camera. 2 days before the gala, they found the diary. It wasn't where it should have been. It was hidden behind the false back of a rosewood writing desk in an upstairs bedroom once assigned to nursery staff. Luis only noticed because one panel sounded hollow when he shifted the desk to photograph the maker's mark. Inside was a small black book tied with faded cord, along with a pressed bit of blue cloth and a brass key no one could identify. The diary wasn't full, maybe 40 written pages in total, but the hand matched a note already found in the nursery ledger. Eliza Hart. Amelia sat under an archival lamp and read the first line aloud before she even realized she'd spoken. If they call me ungrateful for writing this, then let God decide whether a mother can be grateful for being allowed to watch another woman hold her son. No one said anything. The room seemed to narrow around the page. The entries were not dramatic at first. That almost made them worse. They were practical, restrained, written by a woman who had learned that if her suffering sounded too emotional, powerful people would call it hysteria and dismiss it. She wrote about nursing Samuel through a winter cough, about mending the cuff of one of Gideon's shirts because there was no housemaid left who knew how he liked the buttons reinforced, about being told to use the servants' stairs even when carrying the child, about hearing Samuel cry for her at night and having to wait until Mrs. Mercer's bell rang before she could enter the nursery. Then Amelia reached the entry dated March 2nd, 1898. He knows my face now. That should be joy, but in this house, every joy is dressed like theft. Amelia pressed her fingers against her lips. Nora, sitting across from her, whispered, "Keep going." So she did. The next pages opened the wound wider. Eliza had been a seamstress on the South Docks, daughter of a ship caulker and a laundress. Gideon Mercer met her when he came to inspect cargo accounts his father never trusted to clerks. He came back twice for business, and a third time for no business at all. Eliza wrote that he listened when she spoke, which was rare enough to feel like luxury. He asked her what she would do if she had money of her own. She told him she would buy a small house where no one shouted through the walls, and every chair matched because it was bought for love, not survival. He laughed, she wrote, not because he mocked me, but because no one of my station is supposed to dream in whole rooms. He courted her quietly for a year. Walks near the shipyard before dawn. Letters folded into hem orders. A gold thimble as a Christmas gift. When she became pregnant, he panicked for exactly 3 days, then came back with a ring and a promise. They married in a tiny harbor chapel, witnessed by the pastor's wife and an elderly deacon, half blind in one eye. And for 12 days, Eliza Hart was Eliza Mercer. Then Gideon's father found out. The shipping company was in trouble. A merger depended on a society connection with the Cross family, whose daughter Vivian had money, land, and exactly the right surname for men who thought business and blood should never travel separately. Gideon came to Eliza, white-faced and shaking. He said it would be temporary. He said his father would fix the legal issue. He said once the company stabilized, he would make things right. Every woman who has ever been abandoned recognizes that sentence. He did marry Vivian. Eliza wrote that part in only 3 lines, each straighter than the last, as if she had forced her hand not to tremble. I was too ashamed to die and too angry to disappear. That is how survival begins for women like me. Amelia closed the diary and stared at the grain of the table until it blurred. This wasn't the story she had expected. This wasn't a mistress. This wasn't scandal on the margins of a proud family portrait. This was theft in a tailored suit. And it got worse. Because Samuel had not been stolen at birth by strangers in the dark. He had been taken with paperwork and perfume and the language of necessity. Vivian Mercer had delivered a stillborn daughter in late 1897. The child was buried quietly. No public notice, no church bells, no mourning cards. Society women visited for 2 weeks, then resumed their lunches. By January, Vivian knew she would not carry again. Gideon knew Eliza was nearing labor. And somewhere between grief, panic, pride, and greed, the decision was made. Eliza's son would become Vivian's miracle boy. The doctor was paid. The timeline was blurred. The public announcement came late and vague. Eliza was moved into the Mercer house for the child's health, so she could nurse Samuel while Vivian recovered from a confinement the papers described in flattering lies. Amelia read the next page with tears hot in her eyes. She says I should thank her, as she has saved my son from a dock life. She says he will have tutors, polished shoes, a future. As if mothers of poor children do not love them correctly. As if silverware can replace truth. That was the midpoint. The point where Amelia stopped seeing the story as an old betrayal and started seeing it as something structurally crueler. It wasn't just one weak man choosing status over love. It was a whole house learning how to rename robbery as refinement. By the time she finished the diary, dusk had fallen outside the archive windows, and Mercer House reflected back at them like a dark ship. Eliza's last entries were shorter. Samuel had begun speaking in full sentences. He called Vivian Mama in public. He called Eliza Liza, because that was what the house trained him to say. One entry described him falling on the back stairs, scraping both knees, and reaching past Vivian's outstretched hands to bury his face in Eliza's skirt. He knows. In his body, if not in words. The final complete entry was dated September 1904. He asked why I have the same eyes as he does. There was no answer written beneath it, only a tear stain that had puckered the page. Amelia should have stopped there. Any sane person would have. But she was a Mercer, which meant she had been raised inside the machinery of silence long enough to recognize it once she saw the gears. If this truth had been buried for more than a century, it had not buried itself. Someone had helped. She took copies of the marriage entry from the Harbor Chapel records and drove straight to her father's house. Julian Mercer opened the door in a navy sweater and slacks, the picture of cultivated calm. Behind him, a pianist on his living room speakers was playing something too soft to interrupt a lie. "You should have called," he said. "So should everyone else in this family 100 years ago." He looked at the papers in her hand and went still. Amelia walked past him into the foyer. "Did you know Gideon married Eliza first?" Julian shut the door carefully. Too carefully. "You are upset." "I'm furious." "That's not the same as informed." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Try me." He didn't deny it. He didn't even pretend surprise. He walked into his study, sat down behind the desk, and folded his hands like a man about to explain taxes to a child. "My grandfather told me pieces when I was 17, he said. "Not all of it. Enough." "And you just lived with that?" He stared at her as if the answer should have been obvious. "Amelia, families like ours are not built only from virtue. They are built from survival." "No," she said, feeling her voice shake now. "Families like ours are built from what they can get away with." Julian's expression hardened. "Be careful." "With what? The truth?" "With self-righteousness. You enjoy the Mercer name when it opens doors. You used foundation money to fund your graduate degree. You used this family's influence to build that museum career of yours." Amelia felt the hit because it wasn't entirely false. That was the ugliest part of inherited wrongdoing. Even innocence lived on dividends. Julian continued, quieter now. "If you expose this before the gala, you don't just embarrass dead people. You collapse donor confidence, invite legal nuisance suits, stain the foundation, and humiliate every living Mercer who had no hand in the original sin." "And what exactly do you think Eliza lived with?" He looked away, just for a second. And in that second, Amelia knew there was more. She saw it before he said it. "What else?" she asked. Nothing that changes the past. What else, Dad? He stood up too fast. It's late. She slammed the chapel record onto his desk. What else? He stared at the paper for a long, exhausted moment, then opened a lower drawer and took out a long cream envelope tied in fraying green tape. I was going to destroy this after the expansion vote, he said. Amelia couldn't move. Julian placed the envelope on the desk like it weighed more than paper had a right to weigh. It was found in 1987 behind a wall panel during renovations to Warehouse 6. My father kept it. Then I kept it. Her throat went dry. What is it? A letter and a codicil. She untied the tape with fingers that did not feel attached to her own body. The letter was from Samuel Mercer, written in 1921, in a hand much steadier than Amelia expected from a man whose final medical notes, tucked behind it, described advanced lung illness. The first line nearly stopped her heart. If this reaches daylight, let it do at least one honest thing my life did not. Samuel wrote that he learned the truth at 13 from Eliza herself after Vivian struck her in the nursery for answering his questions too directly. He had confronted Gideon, who admitted enough to ruin him in the eyes of his son without fully confessing what cowardice had cost. Samuel wrote that Eliza left Mercer House 6 weeks later with money pressed on her, as if payment could dissolve motherhood. He continued to see her secretly as a young man, sending books, medicine, and once a winter coat through a trusted driver. He never publicly restored her name because Gideon threatened to cut her off completely, and Eliza feared scandal would destroy Samuel's future without giving her a real one in return. But near the end of his life, Samuel had written a legal codicil. It declared in clear language that Eliza Hart was his mother, that Gideon's marriage to Vivian had been entered after a lawful union with Eliza, and that the South Waterfront warehouse and adjoining rental profits were to be sold and used to establish a school and relief fund for dock workers' children in Eliza Hart's name. The codicil had never been filed, never executed, hidden, suppressed, stolen again. Amelia lowered the papers slowly and looked at her father with something deeper than anger. Your father hid this. Then you hid it. Julian's face had gone older in the space of one conversation. I protected what remained. No, you protected what paid. He flinched like she had slapped him. For a moment, Amelia thought he might shout. Instead, he sank back into the chair and pressed one hand to his mouth. I told myself the dead were beyond repair, he said, that all I could do was preserve the foundation and use it for good. And did you? He said nothing. She looked around the study, mahogany shelves, oil portrait, silver-framed regatta photos, the soft, expensive rug underfoot, and thought of Eliza Hart being told wealth would save her child from her. Thought of Samuel growing up in polished shoes under a lie. Thought of how often noble language was just cruelty that had learned posture. When Amelia left with the envelope, her father didn't stop her. The next day, she met Naomi Hart. The Mercer Archives volunteer found her through census records, a marriage line, and one branch of descendants that stayed near the harbor while history books pretended they hadn't. Naomi was 41, a public school principal with tired eyes, steady hands, and the kind of stillness people earn by having no luxury to fall apart. They met in a small cafe 3 blocks from the elementary school she ran. One leg of Amelia's chair was shorter than the others, and the wobble felt strangely appropriate. Naomi listened without interrupting while Amelia explained the photograph, the diary, the marriage record, and finally, Samuel's letter. When Amelia finished, Naomi looked out the window for a long time. My grandmother used to tell us there was a woman in the family who spent years raising somebody else's child, she said. She never had papers, just stories. Everybody told her she was repeating doc gossip. Amelia swallowed. I'm sorry. Naomi turned back to her. Are you? The question landed clean and deserved. I think I am, Amelia said. But I also know sorry is the cheapest word people like me ever get to say. A tiny shift came over Naomi's face then. Not softness, just recognition. My school library roof leaks, she said. Last winter we had to move third-grade reading into the cafeteria because 2 ceiling tiles collapsed. You want to know what bothers me? Not that your family got rich. Rich people exist. What bothers me is that they built their respectability by teaching the world my ancestor was background scenery in her own child's life. Amelia had no defense. Naomi stirred her coffee once and set the spoon down. What do you actually intend to do? There it was, the only question that mattered. Amelia had spent the entire night thinking about strategy, consequences, headlines, trustees, donor agreements, legal review. But sitting across from Naomi Hart, all the polished complications started sounding like the same old Mercer instinct to control the pace of honesty. The gala is tomorrow night, Amelia said. My father expects a foundation expansion announcement. The press will be there. So will the board. Naomi held her gaze. And? Amelia took a breath that felt like stepping off a ledge. And I think that is exactly where the truth belongs. The gala began at 7 under strings of warm light stretched across the Mercer House courtyard, as if beauty could make old lies more tasteful. Women in silk dresses drifted past the fountain. Men in tailored jackets laughed with one hand around champagne flutes. Reporters hovered near the foyer, hoping for history and settling, usually, for money. A string quartet played near the staircase. On the far wall, covered in dark velvet for the ceremonial reveal, waited the restored 1898 photograph. Amelia wore black. Not mourning black exactly, judgment black. Her father noticed the moment he saw her. He came over with his practiced smile in place, but his voice turned flat the instant he reached her. Tell me you came to your senses. She looked at him calmly. I came to my conscience. Julian exhaled through his nose. Do not do this in front of them. In front of who? The people who fund dignity as long as it never inconveniences them? You think public humiliation is justice? No, Amelia said. I think secrecy is how injustice survives. Before he could answer, a trustee approached, eager and oblivious, and Julian had to paste his face back together for the room. Amelia used the moment to cross the hall. Naomi stood near the rear entrance in a navy dress so simple it made everybody else's money look noisy. Beside her was a girl of about 10 with braids and bright, watchful eyes, holding Naomi's hand with total trust. Amelia had never met the child before that night, but the sight of those linked hands hit her like a bell. That, she thought, was what had been stolen from Eliza in plain sight. Not biology alone. Ordinary permission. When the speeches began, the room quieted in the ceremonial way wealthy rooms do when they expect to hear themselves praised. Julian spoke first, as planned. He thanked donors, honored civic partnerships, quoted an old newspaper line about Mercer fortitude, and invited Amelia forward to unveil the restored portrait and announce the future of the foundation. She stepped up to the podium with Samuel's letter folded inside her notes. The lights were warm on her face, the room blurred at the edges. Somewhere in the second row, Nora gave the smallest nod. Amelia looked at the covered photograph behind her, then at the audience. My family has spent more than a century telling one version of this picture, she said. A successful man, his elegant wife, their son, and behind them, an unnamed servant. A few polite smiles, a few waiting glances. Then Amelia continued. But history doesn't only live in the people who sit in the front row of a photograph. Sometimes it hides in the person half-cropped by the frame. Sometimes it hides in the hand no one thought to study. Now the room was listening. She signaled to Nora, who pulled the velvet cloth away. The restored photograph appeared on the screen beside the original enlargement of the hands. A murmur moved through the crowd. Amelia let them see it. Let them register the child's fingers locked around the young woman's hand behind the chair. For decades, Amelia said, historians repeated the Mercer family caption without question. But this restoration led to the recovery of household records, a private diary, a chapel marriage entry, and a sealed letter written by the child in this photograph after he became a man. Her father stood. She did not look at him. The woman labeled in our archives as a servant was not anonymous. Her name was Eliza Hart. She was not background to this family's story. She was at the center of it. Now people were no longer murmuring. They were staring. Amelia opened Samuel's letter and read, "If this reaches daylight, let it do at least one honest thing my life did not. Eliza Hart was my mother." Someone gasped. A trustee whispered, "Good God." Julian took one step toward the stage. Naomi's daughter, from the back of the room, looked up at her mother like children do when adults stop pretending and truth changes the air. Amelia kept reading. "My father, Gideon Mercer, lawfully married Eliza before abandoning her for advantage. I was raised under a lie that benefited wealth, status, and cowardice. The property I direct to the harbor children should bear her name, for she was denied mine in all ways that mattered." The silence after that was unlike any Amelia had ever heard in Mercer House. It was not emptiness. It was collapse. She lowered the letter. "Tonight, the Mercer Heritage Foundation will suspend its expansion campaign. Effective immediately, the board will begin legal transfer of the South Warehouse Trust into a new community fund named for Eliza Hart, in accordance with Samuel Mercer's suppressed codicil. The first commitments from that fund will repair Harbor Elementary School, restore the waterfront reading program, and provide grants for dockworkers' families displaced by Mercer redevelopment." Julian's voice cut across the hall, cracked with rage for the first time in Amelia's life. "You had no authority to announce that." She finally turned toward him. "Then maybe it's time someone did." He stood frozen in the aisle, every cultivated layer stripped off him in front of donors, press, and portraits. For one flashing second, Amelia saw not just her father, but Gideon in him, and Gideon's father behind Gideon, and every polished man who had ever called theft strategy. Then Naomi stepped forward from the back of the room. Not timidly, not triumphantly, just clearly. "My name is Naomi Hart," she said, and the room opened for her without being told. "I'm one of Eliza Hart's descendants. My family kept her story alive without your records, your paintings, or your permission. So before anyone in this room talks about preserving history, remember this: she did not disappear. You only looked where power told you to look." It wasn't loud. That's why it landed so hard. The reporters started moving then. Pens, phones, questions, trustees huddled. One elderly historian in the front row sat down so suddenly he nearly missed his chair. Julian looked like a man watching the floor give way beneath a house he thought was stone. Amelia should have felt fear. Instead, she felt something startlingly close to peace. Not happiness, not yet, but alignment. As if every lie she had inherited had finally stopped asking her to carry it. The next weeks were ugly in all the predictable ways. The papers called it scandal, reckoning, revision, inheritance crisis, archival bombshell. Lawyers surfaced. 2 trustees resigned. One threatened litigation and then quietly backed down when the chapel record, diary ink analysis, and Samuel's medical file all authenticated. A historian from Boston published an essay about class blindness in family archives and used the Mercer case as his central example. People who had once praised Julian Mercer for his stewardship began referring to him as controversial, which, in polite society, is what they say when a man's reputation has been cut open, but they still like his wine cellar. Julian withdrew from public view. Amelia saw him once during those months, in the museum garden by the bare winter roses. He looked smaller, though maybe that was only what truth did to people who had relied on posture. "I was angry at my father all my life," he said without preamble. "You know that?" Amelia said nothing. "He taught me that control was love, that if I kept the structure standing, everyone inside it would be safe." "And were they?" He looked at the ground. "No." For the first time in her life, he seemed like a son as much as a father. Not absolved, just exposed. "I don't know what to do with the rest of my life now," he admitted. Amelia thought of Eliza riding by poor light in a room that wasn't hers. Thought of Samuel learning the truth too young and too late. Thought of Naomi's daughter holding her mother's hand in the back of a room where powerful people finally had to listen. "Start," she said, "by not calling repair destruction." He nodded once, a broken sort of nod, and did not ask for forgiveness. That mattered more than apology would have. Spring brought scaffolding to Harbor Elementary, and with it the strange, beautiful inconvenience of real change. The roof was repaired. The library reopened with tall, bright shelves and a reading corner built under painted paper stars. Naomi invited Amelia to the dedication, and Amelia almost said no out of shame, before realizing shame was sometimes just ego in darker clothing. So she went. Children ran through the hallway with paper bookmarks and untied shoelaces and absolutely no idea they were participating in the end of a century-old lie. Naomi stood near the new plaque by the library doors. The Eliza Hart Reading Room. Below it, in smaller letters, "For every child who deserved truth before inheritance." Amelia stared at the words until her vision softened. Naomi came to stand beside her. "My grandmother would have cried." "Mine would have tried to change the subject," Amelia said. Naomi laughed, and the laugh had enough weariness in it to sound earned. Then Naomi's daughter, her name was June, Amelia had learned, ran up holding a chapter book to her chest. "Mom, can I check out too?" she asked. Naomi smiled. "If you actually finish one." June rolled her eyes in the universal language of children and then looked at Amelia. "My mom says you're the reason this room exists." Amelia opened her mouth and found she didn't know how to answer that honestly without stealing credit from a dead woman who had waited too long for daylight. So she crouched slightly and said, "No, your family is." June seemed satisfied with that. She darted away, one shoe half untied, braids flying behind her. Amelia watched her go and felt, for the first time since the photograph came into focus, the full shape of what had been hidden all those years. Not just a scandal, not just a secret marriage, not just a stolen name. A mother reaching for her child in the only ways power had left her. A child reaching back. And history, for over 100 years, deciding that hand did not matter because it belonged to the wrong woman. The museum changed the caption on the 1898 portrait before summer. Not housemaid, name unknown. Eliza Hart, mother of Samuel Hart Mercer, wrongly erased from the family record. Visitors lingered longer in front of it after that. They didn't care as much about the pearls, or the carved chair, or the expensive tailoring. Their eyes went where Nora's had gone, straight to the hands. Because once you see what love looks like when it's forced into hiding, it becomes impossible to call it invisible. Years later, Amelia would still remember the exact moment the picture changed her life. Not the applause that never came at the gala, not the headlines, not the board resignations, not even the look on her father's face. It was the instant the image sharpened and the lie became physically unbearable. A little boy in a sailor suit. A woman in the background no one bothered to name. And one tiny hand reaching backward toward the person he trusted more than the story allowed. Tell me honestly, if your family's name, money, and respect were built on a lie like this, would you protect the legacy? Or would you give the truth back to the woman who lost everything?